Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. Joining me today is Allison Skufca. Allison and I are going to be discussing strength training for soccer athletes, in particular for in-season considerations, since the season is currently underway for the majority of America that way. So we're going to talk about different things such as periodization. Should you periodize? Should you not periodize? Arm training, the importance of hip strength, and so much more. We cover a lot of ground in this one today, and I highly recommend you check out Allison and all the amazing work she's doing, whether that be with Pivotal or the NSCA Soccer Special Interest Group. Allison is an amazing individual doing great things, and I really appreciate her time on the podcast today. Episodes like this are made possible by ISOFIT. ISOFIT is the official sponsor for season 5 of the podcast. Enjoy. Allison, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for having me.
For people who might not be familiar with you and all the amazing work that you do, especially with the sport of soccer and with the NSCA that way, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all that you do?
I'm a sports performance coach just outside of Denver, Colorado, at a facility in Parker called Pivotal Sports Performance. I've been in the field I'm going on 20 years of being in the private sector sports performance side. I grew up playing soccer, and after college, I ended up coaching I think I coached for 10 years at one of the youth clubs in the area. So I've been around the sport a lot, and I kind of understand it from the player's perspective and also from the coach's perspective and what each requires. That's kind of my background, and just being in the coaching side of it, I obviously got to meet a lot of coaches, not only at the club that I coached for, but at other clubs in the area. And so that was great networking, when I was building my training business to be able to go to those coaches and say, hey, I also actually do this performance training side, and I can help get your athletes prepared for their seasons and stuff. And so a lot of those coaches would send their athletes to me. It kind of started off just being in the off seasons, like in the winter and the summer. And then, I slowly was able to convince them that the in-season training is actually just as important. And, there's ways to strategically, train the athletes so that they're not going to be super sore for a game or anything like that, but still improve their performance on the field. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it. I got my bachelor's degree from the University of Northern Colorado, and I've been a CSCS for 10 years now, 11 years, something like that. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. I really like how you kind of blend that background of playing soccer with the background of coaching soccer with the strength and conditioning and performance side. And I think that's something that's very unique, is I find a lot of strength coaches have experience in sport, but it's not always the sport that they're working with. And obviously we can't expect every strength coach is going to have experience playing every sport ever, but I certainly think it kind of gives you a leg up in the sense that you can relate to what the athletes are going through because you've been in their shoes before as an athlete yourself that way. I'm curious on that note for a second. Where did you feel like strength and conditioning was at when you were a soccer player back a few years ago that way? Was that something that you felt like was really integrated into the sport really well? Did you feel like you were doing a really good job lifting in season, out of season? Was it not really prioritized or emphasized? And what's kind of that evolution of strength and conditioning been in the sport of soccer from when you played to where you feel you're at now?
So yeah, so it's definitely, I think when I grew up in the 90s, I'm a 90s kid. So I was in high school in the late 90s, and it really wasn't a thing. There wasn't, I don't know, strength conditioning. It wasn't how it is now, where you could go to a facility like the one I work at and sign your kid up for training. That it didn't really exist. We did a weights class at high school, and I think my basketball coach, I played basketball as well in high school, and my basketball coach actually would design a lifting program for us. Kind of looking back on it, I'm like, oh, a lot of the stuff we did was probably not great, but you don't know what you don't know, and it was new, and our soccer coaches didn't do anything. I just don't think they knew that it was important. So I was introduced to lifting in high school, but again, it was actually through my basketball coaches that made it a priority for us. versus my soccer coaches. And then in college is when I, really started to kind of learn the whole idea of like periodization and programming, and that there is like a structure to it, and not just like, okay, well, we're going to do this today because that's what we have available to us, or, something like that. So I think I've kind of grown up in the industry of like seeing it evolve to where it is today, to where, again, back when I was like in high school, college, and even coming out of college, it wasn't as big. And so I don't think as many people knew kind of what to do. And now it's like evolved into this whole other thing, especially with like some of the like VBT units. Like we use perch at our facility. So, it's kind of cool to see how you can narrow in an athlete's like weights with using a VBT system, based on like the range I want them to be in and stuff, and get it kind of tailored exactly to where they should be. So
yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of our understanding around strength and conditioning has definitely evolved. And I think the VBT and the tech side of things is a good reference point, because that was something that I don't think was, common practice 20, 30 years ago. So taking that for an example, previously a lot of people were progressed based on percent of 1 rep max, whereas now we can actually progress someone based on bar velocity. So it's a different way to progress people. And I know that some are going to argue, it's great. Some are going to argue it's awful. The same thing can be said about periodization. I've met coaches who periodize everything, even recovery. And I've met other coaches who periodize nothing, and they just kind of go in, and based on how the athlete is feeling, that's how they're going to approach the day. And I think that it's interesting to have that conversation as well, because I've seen both approaches have results for people. I've seen some coaches do really well and athletes respond really well to a well thought out periodized program. And I've seen other coaches have great success with minimal periodization. So I think that having that understanding that there's more than one way to approach this concept of training for the soccer athlete that way is absolutely essential. I think everyone's always looking for the magic bullet, the right way to do everything, when in reality, this is a really gray area with a lot of muddy water, for example.
Yeah, I mean, so to that point, I used to be like somebody who, I programmed everything, like had my periodization plan. And I think now, because the youth sport system has also changed, like we talk about it at the facility I work at, like these kids are actually always in season now. Like, especially my soccer kids, they'll go from, they're starting their fall season now. So fall soccer is going to, kick in hardcore. And then at the same time, tryouts this weekend are for futsal, and futsal will kick in when the fall season ends. And so then they go to futsal season, which is more indoor on a court. It's a little bit different, but it's still playing the game. And then they'll go back to their spring outdoor season. And then summer's like tournaments and futsal tournaments. And so it's like, I've kind of thrown away like a structured periodization plan. And I'll still have like a skeleton of what I want to do, but I do kind of base it on the athlete and their schedule and how they're feeling. Like last week, a lot of my kids started school, and everybody came in and they were exhausted. They were tired. I was like, how are you guys doing today? They're like, oh my God, I'm so tired. So, I did some more different exercises with them that were a little bit more lower weights, a little bit easier structure for them, so that way I knew they were tired after like having started back to school and being on a schedule that they normally haven't been on for the past couple of months. So I think you have to adapt with how your athletes are feeling, and not just be like, well, sorry, this is what I have planned and this is what we're going to do. And I think you'll have more success if you kind of go off of like how the athletes are feeling, what their schedule's like. I have felt that's kind of the better approach to it nowadays.
Yeah, and it's something that is ever evolving, right? Because, 1 week the athletes might have, no games, or, things get rained out and they have a very low intensity week. And then the next week they're playing 3 games to make up for it. And, 2 of them go into overtime, and it's like, well, they're all smoked and exhausted. But that doesn't change the fact that training, you mentioned before about the importance of training in season. That doesn't change the fact that we should stop training just because they're tired. I think it's more about how do we adapt the session to how the
Mm-hmm.
athlete presents that day, as opposed to just throwing away and canning it entirely because they're tired. Because, in reality, I think that we need to understand how important strength and strength training is to keeping these athletes on the field and keeping them do what they love day in and day out. And if we just kind of stop putting our emphasis on that and we start saying, well, you're tired, you're sore, just foam roll, stretch out a little bit, and then we'll call it a day.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're really
Right.
doing the athlete a disservice with that, because that's not necessarily what they need. Yeah, they'll feel good for 10 minutes, but in reality, we should have the knowledge to adjust what we do from a strength and conditioning standpoint to how they present on the day to day. And I think that's something that's really, really hard to pick up from a textbook. I think a lot of times
Mm-hmm.
as you work with the athletes and as you gain experience, you kind of like learn what they respond to better, what they don't really respond to, how to
Right.
adjust and modify based on how they're presenting that day, and so on that way.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, I think it's important because even from when I was in high school to like what my high school athletes do now, like their schedules are insane, not only with their sport, but with their school work as well. Like these kids get more homework than like I ever think I ever had in high school. And so it's like, I don't know, you have to account for that stuff. Some of them are under a lot of stress. Some of them are just juggling a lot of things. I have a few that still try to play multiple sports, and I've got one girl who's literally has softball, then she goes to basketball, and then she's like coming to me in the same day, and I'm like, okay, because that's like really the only time she could fit it in. So again, it's like I know she's gonna do these like multiple things even on the day she's seeing me. So it's like, how can I'm not going to like max squat her when I know she has to go to basketball practice after me. So it's like you've got to be a little bit smarter in your programming. It doesn't mean we can't do anything, but it just means we have to be a little bit more strategic about what we're doing with those athletes.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the biggest part of that as well is the relationship that you form with the athlete that you're working with, because it's very
Mm-hmm.
easy for them to say, well, I'm playing all these sports. I have so little time as it is. I don't think strength training is important, so I'm going to stop doing it. And I think that strength training is the foundation or the fundamental building blocks that allows them to do all of the various sports that they do. And to your point
Yeah.
before about having the ability to adapt to the athlete, I think that the athlete becomes a part of that conversation, in the sense that, if you've got a girl who plays soccer coming into your facility and she says, you know what, I really freaking hate back squat and I never want a back squat. Like, if you force her to back squat 3 times a week, she's probably not going to be too happy with you. Versus if
Yep.
you say, well, the squat's a pattern, I want to train it, we need to train it, but we don't have to train it with a back squat variation. We can do X, Y, or Z, or actually just taking
Mm-hmm.
the time to ask questions and understand your athletes and where they're coming from more, I think can really give you a lot of in-depth understanding on how to program their strength session in relation to soccer or in relation to any other sport for that matter.
Yeah. And like also just teaching these athletes like the foundations of it. Like I have a lot of girls who don't like the back squat, but I think it's because they don't understand how to like brace their trunk for it. So we'll do trap bar, and I think the trap bar is a great way to really kind of teach those athletes how to brace and control those positions, and then maybe progress them to a back squat later on. It's not to say that we're never going to back squat, but maybe, hey, here's how we can kind of change up the implement we're using in order to maybe get you to a back squat. Because especially like if you're going to go play in college, a lot of the programs, they're going to have to know how to do that. So I always tell my athletes, I said, I understand you might not like it, but I need you to know how to do it, because you might do it at your high school strength and conditioning class, or you might need to do it when you go to college. So it's like, let's learn the foundation now, so that when you get to that point, you already know what you're doing. So I don't know. I kind of, yes, we use it as like the performance side, but I also like to use it as an educational, like, let's learn the foundation of these lifts, so that when you get to college, you know what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think that makes
Yeah.
the whole process of transitioning from high school to college so much more seamless for the athlete, because a lot of times college is a very new environment to them. They're around new
Mm-hmm.
people. You mentioned before about other stressors, and I think that that side of college can certainly be a stressor. And then if you throw, you're working with new team, new strength coach, whole new environment, and now you're going to do all these exercises that you've never done before, it certainly adds to that stress level versus if you feel like, well, at one point I didn't like back squat. I still don't love it, but I know I can do it correctly now. I know the fundamentals of it. I know the basic minimums that go into it. I think that makes that transition process so much better. And I think that there's something to be said about starting that foundation early on. And I think that's part of the reason that, I advocate a lot for getting athletes in the weight room in middle school and in high school. I don't really think that there's a age restriction to get in and start training and start learning how to move your body and the fundamentals that go into some of these things later on in life. And in reality, I think the earlier we start that process for athletes, the better. And I think that soccer in particular is one that I see those qualities having such a drastic impact. I know we talked before about injuries in soccer, whether it's soft tissue or non-contact knee or whatever that way. There's a lot of different things that can go into it. And it's like if we actually start exposing athletes to some of these different stimuli at a younger age, like how to actually brace and stabilize your core, how to actually stay strong in multiple planes of movement and so on that way, I think that, doing that long term can certainly have a impact on some of the different trends that we're seeing in today's day and age that way.
I mean, I love when I have athletes who I've worked with since they were probably 12, 13 years old who are now in college. And it's kind of cool, especially when they were freshmen, they're like, Allison, I knew all the lifts. I didn't even need any help. And all these other girls in my freshman class didn't know what they were doing. And it's yeah, see, you were already advanced and already knew what you were doing. And it just gives them, especially girls, it gives them more confidence in the weight room. And they're more likely going to continue after college when they're done with their sport. And it's just going to become a lifestyle thing for them versus it being more something that was needed for their sport. And I'm a big advocate of that too. Let's make this a lifestyle, trend versus, oh, I have to do this because I'm playing soccer or something like that. So
yeah, it's that I have to do it versus I get to do it conversation. And it's so interesting because I feel like some of the athletes I work with in the soccer space come to me and they feel like they need things to be soccer specific. So anything that we do with them, even if it's something as simple as you referenced the trap bar deadlift before, I just try and tell them how it relates to their sport because a lot of them really don't care about their numbers in the weight room. They just care about playing soccer because ball is life at the end of the day. So on your side of things, when you are programming, where do you draw the line or how do you go about balancing, some of those general physical movements or GPP type things that every athlete probably needs to do with that, kind of sport specific element that seems to be so trendy in today's day and age?
Yeah. I mean, I tell my athletes, or if there's a team and the coach is hey, it needs to be specific. I tell them, listen, my job is to get these kids prepared as athletes. So just general preparation of athletes, their athletic ability. And your job is to prepare them as the sport performance or the sport coach for their performance on the field. So I'm tuning kind of the athletic side and they're tailoring in the more sport specific side. And so I kind of like to use that analogy of my job's just to give you this amazing athlete, and then you're going to take them and turn them into this amazing soccer player. I think that the coaches kind of understand that. I'm I'm not trying to do your role, nor do I want you to try to come and do my role. So it's I'm going to let you do what you're good at and let me do what I'm good at. And most coaches tend to, and players tend to be okay, yeah, that actually makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And that collaborative element allows everyone to kind of focus on the things that they're good at the end of the day, right? Soccer coach doesn't have to worry about how they're going to mix in strength work for their athletes because they know they're getting it with you. And that frees up more time for them to do things in practice or modify their practice plan. There was one soccer coach I worked with a while ago who actually told me that they were able to work in more rest periods because they knew the athletes were getting the strength and conditioning work elsewhere. They were less concerned about that. So they actually gave their athletes more of a break in the skill work. And they found that they were getting higher quality work out of their athletes because they were actually able to recover in practice, which I know is like a real foreign concept. It's like, wow, who would have thought of that? So I think that the collaborative piece that you just hit on is really, really essential to kind of bringing the sport to the next level that way. I guess the other piece I'll ask on the programming side is how much do you look for progression in season versus out of season? And how do you kind of differ your approach with these athletes in season or out of season? Or is there really an off season for soccer in today's day and age? Because I feel like, with outdoor soccer, school ball, and then, you've got indoor leagues, you've got, futsal leagues, you've got all these different things. And I feel like the sport really goes constantly, nonstop. So how do you kind of adjust your training as far as like, if you do have time when the athletes are not in sport, do you push the envelope more, and what kind of qualities do you emphasize that way?
So I like to know their schedule. I kind of always ask them like, all right, how many days a week are you practicing? What does your game schedule look like? Because I have athletes that just play kind of like, I don't want to say like lower levels, but kind of on the lower level side, where they're playing their games every Saturday in the regular like Colorado State League. And then I have a lot of the ECNL, GA, MLS Next athletes who are on more of a year-round schedule, and they might not necessarily play every weekend. They might have like a team from Texas come in town for the weekend. They'll have like 2 games, but then the following weekend they might be off. So I really make sure that I understand their schedule. And then that helps me with the programming side. So, and like I said, I kind of believe that these kids are always in season. It's very rare to like find a time when they're not. But I've told them, I'm like, it's okay for us to lift heavy in season, but we keep the volume low. We'll do like sets of 4 or 5, but we're only doing reps of like maybe 3 to 6 at the max, again, depending on where we're at. So, and I'm like, you're not going to be sore from this. Now, if we were doing sets of 15, that's where you're going to be a little bit sore. So just educating the athletes creates the buy-in, and then they're like, okay, yeah, we trust you to do it. And so I'm a big advocate of educating my athletes on why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And on that note as well, on the set and rep range, I feel like it becomes so much easier to get that buy-in from the athlete in season when it's like, hey, we're only going to do 5x5. It's like, that's it. It's not like 4x20. Like, to them, it's like, oh, I can do that. That's no problem. So, and to your point on pushing the weight, I think that there's so many different ways you can progress in season to avoid that kind of soreness kind of thing that you mentioned that way. And one of my go-to examples for the squat is I just have athletes squat to a box instead of doing a full range squat. And not to say that there's not benefit to doing a full range squat, but if your goal is to just put load through the system, there's a lot of different ways that you can make those kind of swaps and adjustments on the fly to get the load, but not necessarily leave someone feeling beat up.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that's hugely important with just making sure that they're, the load can stay heavy, but the volume needs to be lower. I mean, I had a girl I work with who increased her speed and her like vertical jump height in season last spring. Those things can be done if it's done the right way, and it's not by like just loading them up and making them do a ton of volume in squats. Especially players, these high school kids are playing, anywhere between 40 to 45-minute halves. So, and it's, I have players who are playing almost the whole game, and they're, based on the position they're playing, it's a lot of running, and that's a lot of volume. We have to remember that too. Like, and that's why I asked their schedule. How many days a week are you practicing? What do your practices look like? Are you guys like doing a ton of running in practice, or is it more like technical work? Because we have to remember that's all volume too, not just when they're coming to see us. And so that's why I think it's always important to really ask these athletes, like, what does your schedule look like? What did you do in practice yesterday? What are you guys going to do tomorrow? That way I know what to do with them in a safe manner, and we can still increase speed and increase vertical jump when they're in season, if we're doing it the right way.
Yeah, no, I love that. And you're right. You can certainly progress metrics in season that way. And it's interesting to bring up the concept of volume in game and in sport versus volume in the weight room as well, because you're certainly right. Soccer can definitely be a sport of endurance in the sense that, you've got athletes, running in what I would call an interval fashion where, it's speed up, slow down, speed up, slow down, for a
Mm-hmm.
period of about 90 minutes roughly. And I think based on the numbers Antoine shared with us on the podcast recently, most of them are covering about 10 to 12,000 yards in that time
Mm-hmm.
frame. So they're getting some distance in there. And I think that, as you mentioned, the development of strength-like characteristics in the weight room and maintaining those in season, if nothing else, is absolutely essential. But it also kind of makes me wonder, is there a place for some of that higher volume, your quote unquote typical hypertrophy work in the soccer athlete? Because I'd imagine that at some point in that game time period that way, they're going to become catabolic and they're going to
Mm-hmm.
start breaking down some kind of muscle tissue for energy, just from a general physiology standpoint. So I can't help but
Yeah.
wonder if there is still a time and a place for high volume or hypertrophy type block in the soccer athlete that way. And if so, what that would look like, because you're right in the sense that that high volume training and they're already high volume certainly will leave them feeling beat up. But at the same time, I think that there could be benefits to having increased muscular tissue for the
Mm-hmm.
soccer athlete. Or the other piece too, I'd say, is there's certainly like a armor building effect, I call it, that comes with hypertrophy training. And I feel like soccer, although that some people consider it a non-contact sport, those who play it tell me it's
It's
actually
very
involving
much
a lot of
contact.
contact. So
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting how that disconnect happens there. But it's one of those things that I think has a place, but you have to understand what you're doing and how you're doing it, in the sense that, first off, it takes time to build muscle. And second off, if the athlete is already in season, they're already doing a ton of high volume work and they're not, eating enough, sleeping enough, checking all the other boxes, throwing
Mm-hmm.
a giant hypertrophy block on them in the middle of all that is just going to add fuel to the fire.
Yeah. Yeah, there is. So we just came off of the summer. And so for example, my ECNL kids, some of them made it to playoffs. And so they were going late into June. So again, we're still doing more of an in-season thing, even though they're out of school and whatever. So once playoffs finished for them and they were kind of done, the coaches do give them like 2 to 3 weeks off. And so that's when I know that they're off, that's when I okay, we're going to hit more of our hypertrophy phase training. So it might just be like a 2-week block of just good high volume, low weight in the weight room hypertrophy building before then they start getting back into their sport, and then we'll start kind of tailoring it back down. So yeah, I just kind of look at their blocks of when their breaks are. And then that's when if I know that they don't have anything at all, that's when I'll be like, okay, guess what? We're going to go 2 sets of 20 today. Have fun. And they're like, oh, great. And then I know MLS Next is a little different. They do have structured months off on each end of their season. So they had a month off in July. And then they'll have a month off in December. So with those boys that I work with, I do know when those breaks are going to happen, and it's mandatory. All the clubs have to give them that break. So that's when those kids are in their breaks, that's when we'll do all that kind of hypertrophy phase building. So
it's interesting too, because I do think this is, if you are going to do hypertrophy in season or when there's a high workload, I think that this is where the conversation about training the arms comes into play. It's look, depending on the athlete, if they feel better after they crush 4 sets of 20 arm farm to finish, I'll let them do that, understanding that, the arms don't necessarily play a huge role in the sport of soccer, unless I've, completely misunderstood the sport. I think a lot of it tends to be lower extremity dominant that way. And those are typically the kinds of complaints that I see from the athletes that way. So if they're asking me, hey, if I'm lifting in season, what kind of things can I do high volume? It's usually hey, crush your bis and tris here. And it seems to just kind of give them, you mentioned before about the mental confidence. There's something that seems to be, I don't know what the correlation is or if there's any data on it, but there's something I've noticed about athletes being able to get a pump and how they feel mentally in season. So I'm like, look, I'm not going to pump the brakes on that. If you want to crush your bicep curls, crush your bicep curls in season. I don't have an issue with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll let my athletes go. We actually go pretty high volume on our upper body work, even like chest work, back work. Cause I know that they're not indirectly, they're not using like their back muscles a ton. It's more like leg dominant. So definitely, I'll let them go like some higher reps on that. Cause there is going to be a crossover effect, that is going to, give them some of that lower body strength effect as well. So, but yeah, like my athletes love, especially my college athletes, I would always let them finish like their lifts with like a little like gun show, and they'll get in there and crush their bis and tries, and they're like, this is fun. I'm like, cool, like, everybody wants to have nice arms. So, let them have at it and do what they like. Right. So that I can get the work that we need, from them later by giving them what they enjoy to do as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I also think it's one of the things too where you can actually use volume to your advantage in season, in the sense of, maybe you don't want to load your athlete heavy on whatever upper body compounds you've selected for the day. I don't care if it's bench press or overhead press or pull up, chin up, whatever it is that way. Say you just decide, what, I don't want to load them heavy, but I still want to get a stimulus. I think this comes from bodybuilding more, but I think it has a great application for the soccer athlete. Is you can let them do their arm farm session first and then go into all those other things, knowing that they're already going to have that kind of fatigue state of those tissues that you're planning to work, and you can still get a good response from them at a lower weight or a lower volume on the compound stuff that way. And I think, that kind of could get into a whole rabbit hole on CNS fatigue and all these other things that way. And we don't have to go down that today, but I do think that there's more than one way to skin a cat as it comes to training in season for the soccer athlete. And I think that, understanding that upper body training is still important, even though it is a lower body dominant sport, I think is essential as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the way I kind of pair all my like exercises together, we always make sure we're hitting some, at least a push and a pull in one session, right? I like to do both because, again, some of these kids are only coming to me once or twice a week when they're in season. So I want to get all of it in. And so, we always make sure there's at least one push and one pull exercise in there. And it might be like, hey, we're going to go 3 sets of 10. All right. And, you're going to rep this out. Versus then their lower body work, again, might only be like 5 reps, we're going like 4 or 5 sets of that. So, and the athletes like that. They like to have a strong upper body, and especially a sport like soccer, it is contact. And you need to get in there and shoulder some players off. And you do have to have a strong upper body. You can't just be lower body dominant focused. So
yeah, it's so funny you say that, because I call it the turtle back, because the one soccer athlete I worked with was a big Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle fan, and that's just what we came up with. But she had to shield the ball a lot, and she was like, well, if my back is wider and stronger, I can push them off better. I certainly think that that's, again, more of a leg dominant thing, but in her mind, back training related to better shielding of the ball. And I was like, look, if you feel that's helping you, then we're going to keep doing that. Like, I'm not going to pump the brakes on something that you feel is helping you that way. It's interesting too, because even on the lower extremity training side of things, I feel like soccer has a lot of unique considerations that go into it, especially with the amount of lower extremity rotation you get from every shot, every pass, and so on that way. And at least in my mind, this is a sport where I feel like training the hips, in particular, the adductor muscle group, is absolutely essential. And I think this is a muscle group that tends to be so forgotten about and overlooked in our strength and conditioning programming. It's like, well, we made them squat, we made them sumo deadlift, that's enough. And it's like, no, like, we could actually crush the adductors a little bit more. And in this sport, I find that that's an area that you can make a huge difference from a strength and conditioning standpoint, is making sure that the hip complex is really strong and well-rounded.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I like to do like an isolated hamstring exercise. And then I do like like quote unquote isolated adductor exercise, like Copenhagen plank or, any like a lateral lunge or anything like that. Because yeah, those muscles, especially your hamstrings with sprinting, like I want to like arm those hamstrings to be able to like handle those sprinting loads. So I always think it's important to give them, an isolated exercise for that as well. So that they can like, if you look at a midfielder, how many times they're going to sprint up and down the field, it's 30, 40, 50 sprints. So, they need to be armored for that.
Absolutely. And it's interesting too, because we mentioned earlier about injuries, and I see a ton of foot and ankle injuries in soccer. I know everyone talks about hip and knee, and those are probably the big two, but where I'm at clinically, we just seem to get a ton of ankle sprains and different things of that sort as well. And I find that in general, the foot and ankle complex tends to be very undertrained in field sport athletes. So what's your approach to training the foot and ankle complex in the soccer athletes that you work with?
So I'll get them out of their shoes. We'll do, some of my athletes actually like to lift barefoot. So I'll let them do that. I'll be like, hey, yeah, take your shoes off and lift, just in your socks. But I do, at the end of our sessions, I always like to finish with like a little bit of a barefoot stability work. So, whether that be just like a balance thing or like balancing on a single leg and throwing a tennis ball back and forth, or like I have one where the athlete stands in front of me facing a wall and I'll throw the tennis ball off the wall and they have to react and catch it staying on a single leg. And then we'll do like little hopping variations barefooted. I think that's like the best way to kind of train the foot, is because especially these kids, cleats and shoes are so narrow anymore that they're like cramming their foot into this like tiny space. So I want to get them out of their shoes and get their feet to like spread out and like actually contact the ground. And I think that's the most important part of like training the foot and the ankle, is just getting those feet out of their shoes and, letting them like grip the ground and do all that kind of stuff.
Plain and simple, I think the foot has some of the richest nerve endings in the body from a proprioceptive standpoint. So if we never train that and we never let the foot get in contact with the ground, then the athlete's overall sense of where they are in space might be impacted. And on that piece as well, it's amazing how difficult some of these things can be for athletes in season, out of season. It's like, you show them how difficult it is for them to literally just stand on one leg, and it's like, oh wow. And that's something that they inherently do all of the time in sport, right? Like, anytime that you're running, there's a moment when you're on one leg, not the other. Anytime you're changing direction, you're on one leg and not the other, and you have to be able to push off in order to change direction. So it's like, if we're not stable on one leg statically when there's no movement at all, what's actually occurring when we are moving at game speed? What's actually occurring that we can't see with our own eyes from the underlying tissue and joint level that way? So I think having that kind of foundation of static stability at the foot and ankle complex really plays well into that, or having the ability to sense where it is in space. And you mentioned the ball toss drill, and it's something so simple as that. It's like, it's so easy to implement, and I think it's highly underrated and underutilized, because it's like, okay, I'm going to maintain balance on one leg while I'm tracking an object up top, and it adds a different level of reactivity to it, which I think carries over so well to sports, because you're constantly reacting to an evolving stimulus during the game itself.
Yeah, no, and my athletes love that. They're always like, can we do the tennis ball toss at the end? And it's like, yes, we can do it. It's just something so simple as just having them stand there on one leg, and they're like tossing the ball in like different directions. So they have to kind of work a little bit at it. But they love it. They absolutely love it. And I'm like, yeah, go for it. We can do that. Again, it's give them what they like to do as well.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think there's a lot of different ways you can progress that as well. A couple of years ago, we had some guys on the podcast there, Brian Farber and Kyle Valerie, and they had referenced the Hiko sticks and how you can basically have different colored things and, throw it at the athlete and call a color or something like that. So you can add in like a cognitive challenge component as well to it. And, I think that kind of ties in well to today's, I'll call it the modern athlete, so to speak, because I find that athletes always have more than one thing on their mind. So even though they might be playing soccer, that might not necessarily be what's on their mind. So having the ability to train multiple different stimuli from a nervous system standpoint, I think is really cool to see in the strength and conditioning side of things, because typically people hear that and they think, oh, well, that's physical therapy, that's rehab. And I'm like, no, like I want that in your strength programs. Like the lines between PT and strength and conditioning are gray and blurry, and they're that way for a reason. I think that a lot of the, general principles or corrective exercises or whatever trendy term you want to throw behind it that people often think about from a rehab standpoint should be implemented in a lot of strength and conditioning programs from the start.
Yeah, exactly. And I like to do that stuff at the end of the session because they're fatigued from this entire session. So now I'm making you like have to concentrate and focus and balance on one leg. So I think that just has a huge crossover effect even to their sport of like, hey, we're in the like 80th minute of the game and you're tired, but you still have to get this job done. And like, can you like battle through and push through and do it? So it's sort of like getting through that fatigue to focus and do a skill set. I had one I did with my college athletes where they like both balance on one leg and you're holding towels in both hands and they're trying to like do a tug of war with the towel. That's kind of a fun one because then it's like throws in a little bit of a competitive, like you're trying to get the other person knocked off balance while you're maintaining your balance. So
yeah, no, that's great. And it's interesting because I find soccer in particular, there's really a competitive side to these athletes, and they really don't like being good at, or they don't like being bad at things. I've seen athletes who, they come in and they juggle and they're like, well, I only got this many in a row, so I'm going to go home and practice for 2 more hours. And I'm like, what do you mean you're going to go home and like work on this until you're good at it? And I think that there's certainly a unique kind of consideration that goes into working with the soccer athlete that way, in the sense that in general, and again, this is just what I see clinically, I find that they really like to be good at things. And if they're not good at things, they're going to put in the time and effort and energy that it takes to get good at them.
Yeah, definitely. And especially your like overachiever kids, they're definitely going to make sure that they come back the next time and they're really good at something. So
yeah, no, definitely. And I think the other piece that I keep seeing, or there's another topic I want to bring up that I keep seeing thrown around a lot in the soccer world in today's day and age, is this concept of single leg strength. And there's been some coaches that I talk with that pretty much exclusively only train single leg movements. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that, because personally, I feel like there's a time and a place for everything. And I think that single leg strength and single leg movements are great, but I also think that we shouldn't shy away from loading kids on 2 legs with like a trap bar deadlift or a back squat or something like that. Like, I feel like it's like anything, and we can certainly emphasize single leg strength, but I don't think we have to go so far as to only do single leg strength with these athletes.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. Like I'll do something that's, I usually start first exercise is going to be bilateral where, whether that be like a trap bar deadlift or an RDL or something like that, where they're doing something bilateral on both legs. And then maybe my next thing is more of a unilateral, maybe a reefy or, a walking lunge or something like that, where it's a single leg exercise, more dominant exercise. I think both are needed in my opinion. I think it's because I can't load a single leg as heavy as I could load somebody, who's doing a bilateral squat. I think both are crucially needed. So.
No, definitely. And where do plyo contacts fit into that as well? Do you do like any contrast training or plyo when they're in season, or do you kind of look at it and say, well, all the change of direction and all the contacts that we referenced earlier, that's kind of their plyo volume, so to speak.
No, I definitely work it in. I think it's important, especially again, I think as some kids are a little bit more sedentary, they're not as like active. I think it's important to include, some plyometric training, because then that's going to help them on the like movement side of things, and being able to like get in and out of a cut a lot quicker, or sprint better, because we do a ton of pogos, right? Like I guess it can depend on where you're at in your programming in your season. There's low tempo plyometric drills like pogos, and then there's more of your higher intensity drills like a vertical jump, so it's like, where are we at? If they're heavy in the season, I can like crush some pogos with them, and that's going to be just as beneficial than, doing like these high max intensity vertical jumps or a broad jump. But we do it in season and out of season. I think it's important for these kids to always be doing some sort of jumping. I might like potentiate it with like, we'll do maybe a squat, and then they'll go into like a jump, and then maybe like a med ball throw. And the kids kind of tend to like that stuff, right? It makes it a little bit more of a fun session for them, because they're doing these explosive things.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, yeah, especially the depth drop in my mind any kind of depth variation is really essential for the soccer athlete, from the eccentric and overall concept of just slowing the body down. And it's so interesting because, you mentioned things like the vertical jump and being more intensive that way. And we might see it as that from the coach's eye, but I find a lot of times the athletes don't see plyo as being this like huge demanding thing. They're like, oh, cool, I get to jump around a little bit.
Right.
So it's just interesting how the athletes will, a lot of times I see them kind of gravitate towards the plyo more than the heavy lifting, and they'll get, a little bit uneasy about, squatting 70 to 80% one rep max in season, but you have them do a depth jump from, 2 feet or something like that. And they're like, oh, that's it. Like, when in reality, the forces into the ground are so similar. So understanding that, the athlete definitely plays a role into it, like we talked about early on in this episode that way. But I love your point on having a place for plyos in your program. I like your point too on the potentiation effect, the post-activation potential, because I do think a lot of things pair really well with a squat or a deadlift and that sort of thing. And you can certainly get more bang for your buck pairing 2 or 3 things together as opposed to just doing one. Allison, I feel like we could probably talk about this all day long. There's a lot of different topics and considerations that go into strength training for the soccer athlete that way. And as we started talking about early on here, it's certainly evolved over the past several years. And I feel like it's going to continue to evolve our understanding of how to approach this concept of training for the soccer athlete in season and out of season long term. Is there anything that we missed as we were chatting today, or any closing thoughts or closing remarks you might have?
I wouldn't say there's anything you missed. I would just say that, like, for people out there, especially if you're like private sector, I guess also like if you're in the college setting as well, like, I'm a big advocate of like educating the athletes on why we're doing things, and helping them understand where it falls into place with their sport. Because again, these kids, the weight room is definitely not their sport. It's not specific to their sport, quote unquote. So it's like, helping them understand where it's all going to help them with their sport creates so much more buy-in from them. And I think you're going to just get an athlete that's going to come in and want to do everything that you have planned, versus like kind of forcing them to do it and like pulling their arm to do it. They're going to come in and be like, okay, I understand where all this comes into play. So they're just going to give you more effort. And I think that's the most important thing with a lot of these athletes, is getting them to understand why you want them to do these things, versus just being like, well, we're doing it because that's what I have planned for the day. Well, okay,
Right.
And make it enjoyable for them. Do some of the fun games at the end. Like I always try to, especially with my middle school athletes, like we always try to play like a little fun game at the end that kind of pertains to what we were doing the whole session, and let them have some fun with it, because they're going to go home. They're going to get in the car and tell their mom and dad, oh my God, we had so much fun today at training. And they're going to want to keep coming back. So,
Right.
for people who are in the private sector, I think that's important too, is don't forget that these still at the end of the day are kids.
Yeah,
So
definitely. And as you mentioned earlier on, it's the concept of having these athletes come back to you 10 years later and they're still
hmm
training and they still love
yeah,
training. And it's like, the impact you can have by doing this right at a young age is absolutely intangible. So I certainly think there's so much benefit to having the athlete fall in love to training and that process of self-improvement early on.
yeah, exactly.
For people who want to find out more about you and Pivotal, where can they find you at? How can they get in contact with you? Are you on online, Instagram, social media, that sort of thing? Or
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram. My Instagram handle is at coach_Allison214. And I'm also on Facebook, just at Allison Skufca. I'm not I'm on Facebook here and there some of the time. I do have Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, but I don't use it as often. So I'm not even going to give that. I'm not on there as much as like I used to be in the past. But I think Instagram is like the best place to, if you want to follow what I'm doing, follow me on Instagram. So
definitely. We'll link to that in the description below, and we'll link over to the Pivotal Sports Performance website
yep.
as well. That way, if you're interested in learning about the different kind of programs that Allison and her team do, you can just click there and find out more. Allison, I really appreciate your time and everything that you're
Yeah,
doing
thank
in the
you.
soccer space today, and looking forward to chatting with you more again in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate this. It was a lot of fun.